So this is a short lecture, but I want to show you the AWS Lambda configuration parameters. We have the timeout, and this is how long our function is expected to run before failing. And so by default, it's 3 seconds, so we expect quite a short execution time. But you can say, I expect my function to run for a maximum of 300 seconds, which is 5 minutes. And so basically, you set the timeout to however you think your function should run for whatever period of time. And this allows you to fail fast in case there are any problems. We can also send environment variables, and we'll see this in a second. We can allocate memory, so we can say, I want to have from 128 megabyte of memory to 3 gigabyte of memory. So usually the languages that are memory heavy, such as Java, will need more memory to run. We're able to deploy within a VPC and assign security groups to our functions. So we're able to really talk, for example, to our RDS instance deployed in a VPC by deploying a Lambda function in the same VPC. And we can set an IAM execution role within this already, but it must be attached to the Lambda function, and this IAM role must have the correct permission so that your Lambda function can do whatever it is supposed to do. So let's go have a look in the console right now. Okay, so back into the configuration in our function, we're able to see visually using the designer what will trigger our Lambda function and what our Lambda function interacts with. And so right now we can see that our Lambda function, hello world, interacts with the CloudWatch logs. And yes, that makes sense. Whenever we run our function, it will write the logs into CloudWatch. But we're able to add triggers. So all these things can trigger our Lambda function. And as you can see, there's a bit more than what I said. There is even code commits and so on. So all these things can be put on the left-hand side to trigger our Lambda function. We'll get to have a play with this later on. Okay, let's scroll down. This is our function code. And so for the function code, we're able to edit the code in line, or upload a zip file of our code, or upload a full file from Amazon S3. Now, if you're doing stuff in tests, just playing around, editing the code inline may just work using this it's called Cloud9 IDE in the browser. But if we were doing some stuff a bit more safely, we would probably upload a zip file. And so the zip file would contain all the files in here, okay? The next thing we want to do is look at the runtime, and so we're able to select the runtime we want. As you can see, there's different Python version, Node.js version, etc. Finally, the handler is basically Lambda function, which is the name of your file right here. My name is lambda function.py, so we have this Lambda function right here on the left-hand side, dot, and then the function name we will invoke. For me, it's called Lambda handler because we define a function here called Lambda handler. And so this is how Lambda knows which part of the code to invoke when it is being triggered. Okay, let's scroll down. This is a little IDE, and we have environment variables. Now, environment variables are key pairs, and they can be accessed straight from your code. So they basically allow you to modularize the code and make it do different things without changing the code itself. So for example, if I create a environment variable called environment underscore name, and I'll call it dev. Here is my first environment variable. We see we have an option to encrypt these. We'll see this later on in this course. We can tag our Lambda function, so we're able to say whatever tags we want if it was for example, for billing or whatever we want. Let's scroll down. So here is the execution role. And so as we've seen, when we created our Lambda function, we attached a execution role, and for us that was Lambda basic execution. That was giving the Lambda function the right to send its log to CloudWatch. But we could attach a different role or even change that role to give it more permissions. Now for the basic settings, we can set a description of the Lambda function, and here we can set the memory. So we're able to just shift that little button right here to select the memory from 128 megabytes all the way through 300 megabytes. And so basically the more memory you set, the more CPU will be allocated to your function, but the more you will pay. So for now, I'll leave it at 128 because we don't need more than this. Here, we're able to set the timeout. And so the timeout can go all the way to 5 minutes and 0 seconds. And this is how long our function is expected to run. So let's say I want my function to run for 3 seconds. This is the default. I can leave the timeout like this. And we'll get to have a play with the timeout in a second. The network allows us to select a VPC to run in. So if you don't select a VPC, it will have better performance to start your function. If you select a VPC, it might be a little bit slower to start, and that's more from experience than anything else. If you select a VPC, you're able to select the subnets you want your functions to run into, as well as the security groups you want your function to have to run. So we'll just select no VPC. DLQ, we'll see this in the next lecture, as well as concurrency and auditing and compliance. So let's go back to the timeout. Here's the timeout for 3 seconds. Let me go ahead and save my function, and I will go in my code and I will change a little bit the code just to exhibit the timeout behavior. Now, if we test our function, as we can see, it ran. It ran because it only lasted 0.48 millisecond and the timeout was 3 seconds, so we are well below the timeout duration. Now, if I scroll down, I'm going to change the code just a little bit. You don't need to know Python to do this. Import time, you just add this below import JSON, you add import time. And here, after printing the first value, we're going to add time.sleep, and we'll sleep for 5 seconds. So here we're sleeping for 5 seconds. And so what this will do is that it will print the first value, sleep for 5 seconds, and then print the rest and return the result. Let's save our function, and now we're going to test it. And so what we should see now is that our execution result has failed. And so the error message is that the task timed out after 3.01 seconds, which is the timeout we set. We set 3 seconds. So our function basically lasted longer than 3 seconds because we made it sleep. We made it wait 4 or 5 seconds. And so because it lasted longer than the timeout we had set, the function after 3 seconds just failed. And so this is the usefulness of the timeout. Say there was a bug in my function. I don't want my function to run for 30 seconds. I want it to run for 3 seconds and then fail. So this is where you have to use your own judgment and say, how long should my function run for? And this is how you set the timeout accordingly. Now, if I set the timeout to 6 seconds, save my function and test again, now after 5 seconds, what I should be seeing is a success for the execution results. And as you can see now, my function succeeded. It only lasted 5 seconds. And because the timeout was 6 seconds, the execution result succeeded. So this is for the timeout. The other setting that's pretty cool to look at, so I'll just remove the timeout right here, and I'll remove the import time. The other setting that's pretty cool to look at is the environment name. So let's just go ahead and print the environment variable in our code. So again, you don't need to be a Python programmer, but I'm going to import OS. And then in there, I'm going to say that our environment name is equal to os.getEnv. And then I have to pass the name of our environment variables, which is right here. So I'll just pass the environment name. And so this will give us the value of this environment variable, which should be dev. And so here I'm going to run the print statement saying environment name is, and then I'll just have plus environment name. So we're going to print that environment name right here. Now let's go ahead and save this and test our function. And so what we get is the value 1, value 2, value 3, and then we get environment name is dev, and dev was gotten straight from this environment variables. Now I can go ahead and change this to prod, save my function, and test again. And as we can see now, the environment name in our result is prod. So using environment variables, we're able to change how our code behaves without changing the code itself. So basically, that's it for the easy configurations for for AWS Lambda. What I want you to remember is that environment variables are super powerful in terms of making your code change behavior without changing your code, and that the timeout is very important to get right. Otherwise, your Lambda functions will throw errors.